Welcome to Rges Algebra 1, Lesson 13B. We'll be discussing Lesson 6.6 and 6.7 in your textbook. We're talking about completing the square, and then we'll go on to learning how to solve problems by completing the square. Now, by way of review, recall that you know how to square a binomial. If I gave you this, your pattern, of course, would be to square the first term, to multiply them together and double it, and to square the last term. And you've had plenty of practice with that. Now, let's say instead, I want to say I have the first term and the middle term, and I want to know what the last term would be if I completed the square. Okay. Well, what would you do? Rather than double, I would have that, which is 4, and square it. Okay, so take half, and square. And I would have 16 over here. And now this up here is a completed square. Let's look at a couple more. If you had I'm sorry, I don't want to fill in anything there. That's my question, is what would I have over here? Okay, well, very similar to what I've done above, but ignore that. I would have this, and paying attention to my sign. Okay, well, you don't have to pay attention. Half of 10x is 5. Okay, half of the 10 is 5, and then square it, and I get 25. And recall that whether or not this is positive as it was up here, or negative as it is here, when I multiply two positives together, I'm going to get positive 25, and when I multiply two negatives together, I'm going to get positive. So when I'm completing the square, I'll always have a positive for my third term. Now the next example they give you is a little bit squirrely. They said, okay, complete the square, x squared plus 7x plus something. Well, of course, I want to have it and then square it. But when I go to have 7, it isn't even. So what's half of 7? 7 halves is 3.5. And then if I square that, that's 5. If I square that, I'm going to get 12.25. Now, I could also, he prefers decimals, and will mostly give his answers that way, but you should be exposed to this also. Because a lot of times in other textbooks or testing, you'll see it this way. What's half of 7? 7 halves. If I were to just square it as a fraction, the numerator would be 7 times 7, or 49, and the denominator would be 2 times 2, or 4. So know that you could do it that way too, and in fact this is kind of the way I would typically do it and prefer it. Unless, of course, they give you a decimal to begin with, like they do in the next example, where they're saying x, hang on. If we have x squared minus 2.7x plus something, I have to have that, which would be 1.17 would be 1.85. I'm sorry, 1.35. And then squaring that, I'm going to get 1.8225. You can use the calculator for this and this. Okay, so again, always half it, square it, and that's called completing the square by adding that last term. What do I need? So that should be able to get you really all the way through. If they give you something uneven, you could do it as a decimal, like the 7 down here. You could do it, your answer, as a decimal or a fraction. If they give it to you as a decimal, you would always want to give your answer as a decimal. And that should be good for what it looks like to complete the square. Now, how would I use that to solve an equation? And this would be lesson 6.7. Let's say I have 10, try it again. Let's say I have x squared minus 10x plus 7 equals 0. And I notice this is not a complete the square pattern. So take the last term, the numerical term, to the right side, and I'm going to get x squared minus 10x equals negative 7, and then complete the square by adding a third term. What third term would I need? Half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So if I add 25 to the left side of the equation, I would want to add 25 to the right side of the equation. Make sure you keep it in balance. So I can rewrite now that this is a perfect square trinomial. I'll rewrite that as x minus 5 squared. I'll simplify the right side. 25 minus 7 is 18. And now I've got something like a problem you've already been used to. I'd take the square root of both sides. I end up with x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 18. Recall that I could do that in 2 steps. I would take the absolute value of x minus 5 equals the square root of 18, and then getting rid of the absolute values with the plus or minus here. So you could do this with that intermediate step, or you could just jump right over that. Now, take your 5 to the next side, or the right side, and I'm going to get plus 5, plus or minus the square root of 18, and at this point, you'll pull out your calculator, you'll crunch your numbers, and you'll get 9.24 and 0.76. Okay. Let's look at another one that's more complicated. What do I do if I have a numerical term in front of my first, or numerical coefficient in front of in my square term? First off, I'm going to divide everything by 4 to get rid of that numerical coefficient right there. So 4 divided by 4 is 1, and I'll end up with x squared plus 12 divided by 4 is 3x minus 7 divided by 4. I'm going to do this with fractions first, and then I'll go back and do it with decimals. This is the way I would tend to do it. Okay, I'm going to take this to the right side, because that does not represent a completed square. So I'll have x squared plus 3x equals 7/4. I'm going to complete my square by adding a third term. Half of 3 is 3/2. Square it, and I'm going to get 9/4. So I have to add it to both sides of the equation, here and here. And now let me come back here and say this. Okay, so what would that be if I write this as a binomial squared? This becomes x plus 3/2, the whole thing squared. And since these already have a common denominator, 7 plus 9 is 16/4, and 16/4 is 4. Okay. Now I'll take the square root of both sides, and I'm going to get x plus 3/2 equals plus or minus square root of 4 is 2. Subtract the 3/2, and I'm going to get x equals -3/2 plus or minus 2. Evaluate it twice. Sorry, I'm trying to pull my board up there. A -3/2 plus 2. 2 is the same as 4/2. So I'm going to think it that way. -3/2 plus 4/2 is +1/2. And -3/2 minus 4/2 is -7/2. So this would be a perfectly good answer. There's another way, of course, you can do it, and that would be looking at it with decimals. So let's do that for our last example. Again, I'm back up to for my original problem. For x squared plus 12x minus 7 equals 0. Take that to the right side. Well, actually, let's just go ahead and divide it first. Divide by 4, just like we did. X squared plus 3x and 7/4. Make that a decimal instead, and that would be 1.75. Pull that to the right side of the equation. Complete the square. Half of 3 is 3/2, which is, again, I'm going to write it now in decimal form, 1.5. Squaring 1.5, I'm going to get 2.25. Adding it to both sides of the equation. Okay, this becomes then x plus 1.5 squared equals 3/4. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. X plus 1/2 equals plus or minus 2, and x subtract 1.5 plus or minus 2. Negative 1.5 plus 2 is going to be 0.5, or negative 1.5 minus 2 is going to be minus 3.5. And now these are two perfectly good answers in the decimal form. He tends to prefer the decimal form. I tend to prefer the fractional form, but I want you exposed to both. So after that goes here, let's see if some review with absolute value. Should be fairly straightforward. We'll talk about any of your questions when you get to class.